Good evening, everybody, by the way.
Good evening, by the way.
See everybody here. One nice thing about this Jumbo China Buffet, too, is I think we'll be able to talk without blocking out the vision from the poor folks that are sitting over here. So that's, every week my wife reminds me I'm standing in people's way. So hopefully it won't happen.
I forgot to have Jim or John open the prayer.
All right. Jim, remind me when I'm finished with announcements if you'll just open with a word of prayer. Okay, remind me if you would. First of all, to talk quickly about Paul Michael Raymond and our old-fashioned Election Day sermon coming up this November the 6th, our second annual old-fashioned. How many were at the last one, by the way? The one before. How was that, by the way? Yes. Well done. Well done. Well attended. John Weaver did a terrific job. This year we have Dr. Paul Michael Raymond. I got a chance to meet him last week in Appomattox, Virginia. A very serious man, a very intense guy. You know, he stares at you like this when he's talking to you. And one thing I really liked about him, I liked a lot of things about him. One thing I really liked was he's very serious about working within his local community. You know, we went out for coffee when we were with him and went to a couple of gift shops. Everybody knew him. I mean, the people behind the counter knew him, the people on this side knew him. So he's not just some, as we're often used to in these types of circles, we're often used to the ivory tower intellectuals, you know what I mean? The guys who can write the books and can't influence their neighbor. This is definitely not one of those kind of guys. Everybody knew him. Got a chance to see his building there. I think they fixed trucks there or something at one time, and he had some friends and got a little money and was able to actually build the new Geneva Academy there. And what he's doing with the new Geneva Academy is he's got lots of books, got a carpenter there that built a whole bunch of, what do you want to call it? Bookshelves, custom bookshelves. I know this. There were bookshelves I saw there. There's lots and lots of bookshelves. Yeah. Thanks for the help, guys. And he's got a lot of reference books there. He's got some books for sale. But what he does, he's using technology to teach. So he has students right in his building, but he also has some students that he teaches by remote or at a distance or whatever. So he's doing a lot of good things. One really cool thing he has going there, which would be a lot of fun to just, I don't know, do a trip down to Appomattox to see this. He's got something that I think is exclusive in the whole wide world. I don't think anybody else has this. He's got microfiche of American newspapers from 1600 all the way up to 1820. I don't think anybody else has it. We were looking at some of them. So you could literally look and see what the newspapers were saying during, for example, the War for Independence, during the War of 1812. You can see what they said about the whole Tea Party thing, the arguments over the king and so forth. That's available. How many of you want to jump in a bus and go down there? That would be a fun day.
Wait a minute.
Now, if you don't
Wait a minute. I was going to say, how long do we stay?
Really?
It's a one-way trip. You stay as long as you want.
1600s.
You have to stay at least a couple of days to do something like that. But I didn't know there was such a thing even available. One thing he's trying to do, I don't know if we'll get it done. He's got he's in Appomattox. There's a grocery store that moved out, so the shell is still there. He's trying to get Russ Dooney's library moved to Appomattox so he can have his own little personal. Be another reason to go down there. But he'll be preaching a sermon on tyranny, independence, or liberty under God. A few of us have heard at least part of that sermon already, and he's a man that really understands the relationship between, as already mentioned tonight, between law and liberty. Any other law is not liberty, right? Any other law is an attack on liberty. We'll be able to hear that. Hope you can invite some friends. We do have, I believe, some posters tonight. Yes, we did. We do. And if you'd like to, what we're trying to do this year to promote this, last year we tried to do it through the churches and only have, shall we say, limited success that way. This year what we're asking you to do is if you live near, and everybody does, some grocery stores, and some of those bulletin boards that they have in different restaurants and so forth, where you just post up posters. How about that? I got that one. Post up posters. Take some and just put them up. And let people know about the old-fashioned Election Day sermon that we've got coming up, because it's an excellent time to learn about the connection between that law and liberty, something that is not talked about that often. Yes?
We have the smaller versions too for
For a friend,
Fred.
if you want to hand out.
Yeah.
So we're
Or a bulletin insert if you're fortunate enough
to
to. And we'll
copies
post
of
these
those
on our website so you can download.
Okay. All right, downloadable, very good. Yes?
Don't forget to tell them about emailing their email lists that they have.
Thank you. You all have circles of influence that I sure don't have. And just encourage you to get the word out. If there's ever a time when we should be hearing about Election Day sermons, this would definitely be the time. And it's going to get more so, I think, as time goes on. Yes, again, Randy.
Yeah, I'd like to make one announcement. Can I squeeze it in at the end when you're...
You can squeeze it in now, because I think I'm finished.
Oh, okay. Sam Rohrer is going to be coming to Wallingport on the 30th of October.
Okay.
Preach. Maybe Bob, you want to give him the address or the particulars? He's coming up on the 30th of October to preach at the church.
It's 233 Main Street in Wallingport. You just come up 873, is that right?
Yes.
873, right through Wallingport and right through Slatington and then
Across the river?
946. Well, okay. Slatington, Wallingport, and we're on, it's a little church on the left side heading out of town there. 233 Main Street.
If you're coming up 7th Street out of Allentown, just follow 7th Street right up, 145, until you get to Wallingport. At the light at McDonald's, make a left,
Yeah, there you go.
and then go down a block and a half. It's on the right-hand side.
Second church.
Second church.
Wallingport doesn't have a McDonald's.
Yeah.
No way.
They even have a red light right there.
All right, we're good
There's a
stuff.
Burger King too there.
How about that? All right, Sam Rohr.
Teamwork.
Okay, Jim, if you want to open us up in a word of prayer.
Thank you, Father, for allowing us to be here tonight, Lord. We thank you for each person who has come out. Thank you for the good fellowship and learning that we have. Father, we desire to learn how to live by your word, and we desire to teach others. And Lord, we pray that we would see thousands or even millions of people turn and love your word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, well, tonight is open forum night. The good news is it's not recorded, so you won't get in trouble for anything you say, and of course neither will I. One of the things that we wanted to attack
Will be video.
Just a finger in your imagination.
Pay no attention to the camera in the corner.
Okay, we are on video.
Look at that.
Get
Just pretend it's muted.
We've let folks know about this open forum night, and some people emailed us with questions, which we want to include tonight. And one of them was what really caused the Great Depression. And I want to just have a very brief PowerPoint presentation on that. It's very, very brief. We have folks in this room that are far ahead of me in terms of economics and so forth. But I want to address something that I don't think is often addressed. And first of all, we ask ourselves, what was the Great Depression? It was a time when investors could not get their money out of the bank. Investments lost their value. Jobs became scarce. And money became scarce. There's probably more to that, but how many of those four are we at right now? At least three, right? At least three. Now, of course, it's denied that we're in a depression. But let's go forward with this. What caused the Great Depression? Government interference caused the Great Depression. Good times will happen only if we can compare them to bad times and vice versa. As long as the stock market can rise, it can fall, but we don't call it a depression every time we have a problem, because the market will correct itself. Now, I said the market, not the free market. I'm not necessarily talking about the stock market there. I'm talking about the market. I have a weird quirk about that, and don't worry, I'm not going to throw you out. I'm not going to start a new church over it. But we usually use the term free market, don't we? Well, what is the free market? What's the opposite of the free market? I call it the molested market, right? Or the messed with market, right? See, the market, if it really is the market, insofar as it's the market, is free, right? It is. We don't have anybody come along and tell us that you have to charge, $19 for the toaster you're selling at a yard sale. That's the market, right? But anybody who tells you you've got to do this or that, or you got to register your toaster, now the market's getting messed with, isn't it? The market corrects itself, as long as it can be the market. If the market is preventing from correcting itself through state interference, then the problem will only get worse for two reasons. The corrective mechanism has been eliminated, and the fix will always be proposed by the same source that created the problem to begin with. Now think about this. It's just the simplest thing, and as I studied this and thought about this, if the market corrects itself, then if you mess with the market, then you've messed with the ability to correct the situation, right? If you get a flat tire, you fix the tire. You don't, there's not a lot of options, right? And if the market is the corrective means, then to mess with that market is to eliminate your ability to correct the problem. Then who comes along and offers a solution? Well, the very people who caused the problem to begin with. More on that a little bit later. The history. Stock prices peak in September 1929. By Monday, October 28th, a couple months, and that was early in September 1929, the prices lost 17%. Throughout that Monday, prices lost an additional 13%. By closing time on Tuesday, October the 29th, the prices had fallen an additional 12%, totaling 42%. Question. Anybody see a depression there? See problems, but does that mean that we have to have problems with money supply? Does that mean that we have to have problems with jobs? I'm sure your income will take a hit. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on, but do we have to have a depression? Think about that as we move on. Here's a question I want to ask. Had this happened before? In 1907, the stock prices had dropped further, around 50%, although it took nearly 2 years instead of 2 months. But there was no Great Depression then. It was merely designated as the Panic of 1907. Why panic in 07 and depression in 29? Keep in mind that over those 2 years, the stock prices dropped even more. Why no depression in 07? Why did we have to have one in 29? It wasn't like this was all that brand new. Look at the previous panics that occurred. It wasn't anything new. So what's going on? Well, let's just take a look at this panic that happened in 1907. Right there is the panic. In December of 06. So between 04 and 06, let's say you got at the worst time in 04. Right, this is Dow Jones Industrial Average. Look at those numbers. And they tell us that inflation is like 0.2% or, yeah, kidding me. Anyway, so you get in at the worst time, actually the best time. Let's say you sell here. Or let's say you get in and you hold on. And then you sell here. Has that been a terrible investment? It's not great. A few percentage points, right? It's not terrible. Well, right here's the panic. And then then it goes right back up to where it was before. Let me ask you something. Does that look really unusual when it comes to stock markets, what we're looking at there? I mean, the amount is pretty great, over 100 here, almost down to 50 here. But that's pretty extensive, is it not? Why was there no Great Depression here? Why did we have to have one in 1929? Can anybody think of something that we had in 1929 that we didn't have in 1907? Yeah, John, take a wild guess.
Excessive credit.
Okay? Writing all kinds of credit. Couldn't back up. Anything else?
Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve and income tax.
Yeah, excessive.
Yeah, Federal Reserve. You know, one of the guys, his name was Aldrich. If you study this a lot more than I have, there was a senator, a Republican from Rhode Island. Anyway, sorry dear, my wife's from Rhode Island. That's where he was from. Guess who, after this panic, guess who set up all kinds of inquiries and all kinds of congressional investigations to find out what caused the panic and to punish the people responsible?
Senator Walton.
Senator Aldrich. And who do you think the main guy was, the main senator was, to get all behind the Federal Reserve?
Could have been Aldrich.
Yeah, same guy.
Grandfather, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller.
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan was the guy that caused the panic.
Guy that caused the panic and fixed it, if you will. But the point is here, it got fixed, didn't it? It got fixed with no intervention. That's the point that I want to make tonight. That's the point. So we did all the investigations here. We investigated all over the place. We set up this Federal Reserve. The reason why the Federal Reserve was set up in part was so that we don't have any of these panics anymore, right? Really fixed everything, right? So the next time we had a panic, now we had a Great Depression. Wow. Now, when you talk about credit, does the Bible speak to this issue? Is this a Bible thing, or are we just talking about real technical stuff here that doesn't have anything to do with the Bible? And I know we have two men that want to speak to this tonight. I want to give both of you gentlemen a chance. John, we'll start with you as soon as I'm finished, and then Dale, you get a chance to talk a little bit, if you'd like. But when you're talking about false weights and measures, the Bible is very serious about that. Anybody remember, I know we've talked about this before, anybody remember the first silver transaction or precious metals transaction in the Bible? Anybody remember?
Abraham.
It was Abraham. It sure was. Abraham conducted a precious metals transaction, silver, with people that a lot of people believe didn't even know the language. They couldn't even talk to each other. They probably had an interpreter. And that transaction, when Abraham buys a field, or basically a burial plot for Sarah, when he buys that for her, that is referenced often in the New Testament. In fact, Stephen references it when he's speaking to the Sanhedrin in Acts 7. He references that very thing. Now, why? Why so much attention on just buying a field? Because the transaction took place between two people, and there were no government agents. There was no devaluation of the currency. It was just happened between two people, and that's all. See, nowadays we're told that we need all kinds of extra government interference, or we won't even be able to trade. It's opposite of that. Anybody ever seen the big statue outside the Federal Trade Center in Washington? Anybody ever seen that one? Seen it? Do you remember what it is?
No,
It's so weird. You got to forget it. It's just weird. It's this huge statue, metal statue of a naked man. That's reason enough not to look at it. And he's holding back two huge horses that are like rearing up. And you know what the caption says? This is outside the Federal Trade Commission building. The caption says, "Man restraining trade." Now, if there's anybody that can explain that, I'd be interested to hear. Why? Should we have had that guy with the horses telling Abraham, no, you need somebody to tell you how much this field is worth. You don't know. We had the government interference happening in 1929. Prior to that, we had a real market, or something close to a real market, which is what the Bible supports again and again. The greatest theologian that we've had in the last millennium, John Calvin, spoke to this issue in his Institutes. And he spoke to the issue of what the government has to do with trade. He spoke to it. He made the point, he said the only issue that the government has to do with trade is to punish theft. That's it. We don't need the civil authorities to tell us how much anything is worth, to invade our yard sales, or to tell us that we can't bring in chainsaws for a certain amount of money after Hurricane Andrew hit South Carolina. That happened, you know. That happened. After Hurricane Andrew in 1972 hit South Carolina, people were helicoptering in chainsaws, which is what they really need. Of course, they were charging an awful lot for the chainsaws. Cost a lot to helicopter them in there. Sure enough, the civil authorities got a hold of it. What do you think they did? Oh no, this is gouging people for charging much money for chainsaws. We're going to tell you how much you can charge for a chainsaw, and they did. And guess what happened to the chainsaws? Of course, they stopped coming because they couldn't afford it. Calvin is right. The only responsibility the civil authorities have to have in the area of commerce is to punish theft. That's all. I know, John, you wanted to address this perhaps a little bit.
The only thing I'd like to add about the Great Depression, most of the Depression was caused, for the common person, most of the Depression was caused by the bank failures, not the loss of investments. And the bank failures were predicated, or they happened because most banks, all banks, were working on a fractional reserve basis. Fractional reserve meant that the money in circulation, the paper money, was only backed partially by the gold that they were supposedly having in their vaults. By the time of the Great Depression, the reserve ratios were down to about 10%. Fractional reserve banking actually works, even though it's fraudulent. The paper says it's redeemable. All the paper that's out there says it's redeemable for specie, silver or gold in the bank, which is impossible when all that gold and silver isn't in the bank, and it was never in there. But at 40%, people have a certain amount of confidence in the banking system. But owing to Federal Reserve regulations and various state regulations by that time, the reserves were down to about 10% of real money in the banks. When people panicked because, well, they had lost so much money in the stock markets and their investments and things seemed very turbulent, they went to the banks, and the banks didn't have the money. They went to the banks to get their money out, and they went with paper. We think of our paper money as being money, but they want to get their money, which is the gold and silver. So we had a lot of bank failures because the banks were essentially a fraud, just like they are today. They say they have money. What we have are digital entries in a computer. But because of that, we don't have the runs on the bank today because we can always put more digital entries in there. We will, however, have massive inflation. So the Federal Reserve, installed in 1913, as Joel has already mentioned, allowed for inflation. It allowed for the development of a culture of debt. People enjoy being in debt because in an inflationary environment, you can pay off your debts with money that's increasingly easy to get, because that's the nature of inflation. There's more money running around, there's more money being printed, there's more and more availability of money, so that increases your ability to pay down your debts and essentially cheat your creditors. So by inflating money, by having the ability to inflate through a Federal Reserve, we create the culture of debt, which is, of course, spoken against in the Bible. We are to be lenders, not borrowers, because the borrower is always the slave to the lender. We are not to be indebted to anyone but God. And by running against biblical principle, running fraudulent banks, inflating the money supply, making credit wildly available, running up the stock market on margin, people could buy stocks on 5 and 10% investment of the actual money. It all fell apart. So excessive credit caused by the Federal Reserve, a fraudulent banking system, again caused by the Federal Reserve. You can lay it all at the feet of the government. There's a lot more to talk about. There was a free banking system prior to the Federal Reserve that was perverted by the various states. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about those kinds of things. Those caused a lot of the panics that we had already looked at. 1873 was a prime example of that as people were expanding into the West. The 1907 panic, a lot of people say J.P. Morgan caused that so that he could solve it and cause the inquiries by Senator Aldrich in order to sneak in the Federal Reserve. The banking interests, the moneyed interests in the East Coast were desperate to have a central bank. And they needed a good panic, and they got one in 1907. So those are the few comments that I'd like to make about the Federal Reserve. All government. Government caused it, and government prolonged it.
Promoted it. Yes, Barbara.
Can you expand that last little bit about, I was about to ask you about, you explained the mechanics, but what about the motivation? So the motivation to create the Federal Reserve
Yes.
was?
The American experiment was allowing the creation of fabulous fortunes. Carnegie, the Rockefellers, these things were happening because the United States had a relatively free and open market. It wasn't regulated. The Bank of England had been created in the 1600s to protect the moneyed interests in England. Without a central bank here, what happens is that the government was mostly constrained by the tax revenues that they could collect. With a Federal Reserve, essentially under government control, and when they knew it would be a gradual progression, because people wouldn't accept a full-blown central bank called a central bank. That's why they named it the Federal Reserve. It's not federal, and there are no reserves. But by being able to have to fund an unlimited government, you could start to also regulate the accumulation of wealth. These guys didn't like the competition. So most government bureaucracies, starting with the Department of Agriculture in, I think, around the Civil War era, 1860s, 1850s, something like
Called
that.
the AAA.
Yeah. Most federal bureaucracies are there to protect the entrenched interests. The FDA is there to protect pharmaceutical companies. The Department of Agriculture was there to protect the big farmers, or the farmers in America from the farmers overseas. The Department of Education is obviously there to protect teachers' unions and school administrations. It goes on and on and on and on. How do you fund all that stuff? You fund it either by tax dollars or by being able to borrow money in an unlimited fashion. That's what central banks are for. The central banks protect the biggest banks, and they fund the government. The government doesn't really even need tax revenues now. All they have to do is print it and steal it out of our bank accounts, because inflation is decreasing the value of our savings. It's an invisible tax. So these guys really wanted the Federal Reserve in place to do unlimited war. We never had world wars before there were big central banks. World War I, World War II, what's going on now? Absolutely impossible without a central bank. If the government had to come to us and collect tax revenues to fund what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and 150 other countries, it couldn't be done. They don't need us. They really don't need us. They have the Federal Reserve, and that's what that was all about.
Yeah, Randy, then. Yeah.
Real quick, when J.P. Morgan died, his estate was worth about 7% of what it was worth. The rest was owned by Rothschilds. Rothschilds, when they set up the banks of the 5 banks in Europe that they set up, they demanded that the governments of those countries could tax the people. So that's why you had the income tax and the Federal Reserve. The income tax made sure that the Federal Reserve was going to get paid. And the way it's set up is you can never get out of debt. You will never pay that debt down with Federal Reserve because that's how the banks, which is a private entity, you don't even know who owns the Federal Reserve, that's how they make their money. So you got a compounded problem there in that they're never gonna get rid of the Federal Reserve unless we go to a market.
Right, get back to the market. Yeah, they've made us permanent slaves.
Yes, absolutely. And most people don't understand that.
Yes,
Picking up on the crisis point that was mentioned earlier on the fraudulence that you see in the bank. I got today, I believe it was today or yesterday, from Agora Financial, I don't know if any of you have seen that, where they're actually calling for a bank transfer day on November the 5th. You guys have probably heard about that, where they're doing a social communication system through Facebook, and they're urging thousands and thousands of people to hit the banks on the same day and withdraw their funds, close their accounts, withdraw their funds. And that's the kind of stuff that can create the panic that can cause us all kinds of.
why are they doing that? What's,
Well, there's some of the very same things John was saying. It's a fraudulent system. They're central banks. They're the money isn't there, the gold isn't there, the money's not there. So let's go withdraw the big bank centers that are causing the problem. We'll all hit the banks at the same time. Now, if that happens, our Wall Street people, and even the Tea Party people, all this, that happens, we could be in one of these crises again very quickly. But they're saying November 5th is the day.
Who's putting that on?
Well, it's through, it's the Facebook campaign that encourages people to close their accounts at the big money bank centers.
But if Facebook isn't doing it, somebody must be behind
And
it.
somebody's promoting it. Well,
Wall Street.
Could it be Wall Street itself?
I think, no, I think it's Occupy Wall Street, 'cause
Yeah,
I saw that.
it's those people, but I mean,
okay.
who has thought this up, where's it
They're
coming
hoping for
from?
anarchy.
Yeah,
That's what they're hoping.
so if we end up with anarchy, we end up with a bank collapsing.
Which, yeah, then the people that are organized are gonna be the best off. One of the things, John, that you mentioned when you spoke on finances here in the Mars presentation that I hadn't thought of. The Bible, again, is serious about weights and measures, honest weights and measures. That shows up again and again. And I never really thought of it, but the British pound, when you name your unit of currency a dollar or a mark or yen or whatever, what's that mean? But when you name it a pound, now you can weigh it. Now you can tell if you're dealing honestly. And so one of the things that you can do then to get away from honesty is name it something else. Get away from the pound, and then it doesn't matter what it weighs or whatever. I don't know when the British pound came into being, but there was an awful lot of Christian influence in Britain there for an awful long time. I just can't believe they came up with the pound at a time when there was pagan people running things. It had to have been Christians, because Christians would be the only ones interested in an honest system like that, because the Bible is so big on that, honest weights and measures thing. I have a friend here tonight, his name's Dale Lutz. He's done an awful lot of study on this. He's a principal at Twin Valley Bible Academy I've known for years. Dale, if you want to speak to this issue, go ahead.
I probably need reins. I'm probably the one that generated this discussion, and I had no clue that you asked for questions for a discussion tonight. I emailed Joel, I said, Joel, help me out here, I want to know the cause of the Great Depression. So I'm probably the reason for your anxiety tonight.
And of course, I was just the guy to ask, since I know.
Well, whatever. I didn't stop studying, and a couple conclusions I've come to. I don't think I'll disagree with anything said here tonight, but I looked at it from a different point of view altogether. When I look at it, I see the stock market crash, I say, okay, what made people want to pull their money out? When I see the Great Depression and the bank failures, I say to myself, what made the common person want to pull, what made him scared? What made him scared? I came to the conclusion, first off, that the Great Depression and the stock market were two totally separate events. They were not connected. They ended up feeding each other, but they were not connected initially. Let me start with the stock market. It's probably the easier one. This is what I found out so far. And this article that I have, Harold Bierman, Cornell University. Don't get too scared. Okay, this is a pretty sharp article. Excellent article, in fact. He comes at it from the point of view that it was not the stock market's fault. Okay, he's done research into it. He's looked at the patterns of the stock market. He says there are two things, basically, that caused the stock market to come down. The first one was scary headlines in the New York Times and the papers around the country. That started with a man named Philip Snowden, England's Chancellor of the Exchequer, who described America's stock market as, quote, a speculative orgy. That was picked up by the New York Times on October 3rd, 1929, and they said, quote, stock prices crashing, frantic selling. October 4, page 1 article, year's worst break hits the stock market. The article on the first page of the Times cited 3 contributing factors: large broker loan increases, the statement by Philip Snowden, and weakening of margin accounts. What he basically says is that drove people to get scared. They read this in the major headlines of the major newspapers. It scared a lot of people. There were people who did buy on margin, okay? And there were margin calls made where the people issuing them started demanding more money for their margins because they saw something coming. The second thing I think is even more relevant. This addresses the answer, or this addresses the issue that's kind of floating all around the room here, okay? The 20s were a period of enormous growth. I have an article here, 72 pages long, that looks at all the things that were happening in the 20s. Radio was coming into being. Electricity was coming into being. They were capturing plants and industry. They were revolutionizing production methods and things like that. And what was fueling all of that were public utilities, or were utilities, okay? The utilities were becoming more and more public. What happened at a point, and I'm not sure if I can find it here exactly, what ended up happening, Sunday, October 27 edition of the Times had a 2-column article stating, quote, Bay State utilities face investigation. Now, the utilities were a huge chunk of the market at that time, and that was a huge growth industry. It was attracting a lot of investment. All of a sudden, there's a fear they're facing regulation. Later on, there's a couple other articles. October 29 again carried an article in the New York Public Utility Investigating Committee being critical of the rate mark. What is it? Rate? Where I lost it now. The rate making process, okay? A number of different, New York, Connecticut, and a couple others, they put it in the papers. They were investigating utilities. They were going to regulate the utilities. They were going to cap the prices they could do. This scared investors, and that's what started happening. These people that I read here, in this one at least, go through and look at the market and they say, the common idea that the market was overvalued at the time because of speculativeness is not founded. Up until the days of the crash, the companies were producing reports that were very optimistic. Very, very few of them were looking at bad times ahead at that point. The investors knew this. They were operating on what they basically call sound fundamentals for investing in the market, okay? Everybody wanted in it, but it was a huge growth industry because American industry was revolutionizing. You had all these new things coming online at the same time. So the crash really resulted because of fear from the media and regulation from the government. And that scared the people out of the market.
What two things again? Fear.
Fear generated by the media. and the potential of regulation of the utilities, which was a huge industry, a huge part of it.
That's a tough combination to stand up to.
It's going on today. You look at the media today and what it's doing. You know, it's the same basic thing. Now, the Great Depression was a whole different issue in the beginning, okay? From what I figured out at this point is, during World War I, the American farmer was called on to supply food for virtually the whole world because Europe was not producing its own food. They couldn't produce it, they were at war. The government stepped in, of course, and started helping fund and create co-ops, farm co-ops. Farm co-ops became huge competition for the small farmers. In order to compete, the small farmer had to go out and buy new equipment, which was just coming online. The gas engine was coming online. Tractors were coming online. That required all kinds of new balers and I don't know the stuff, okay? But all the stuff that goes with farming required all new stuff. These farmers went out and got second mortgages on their homes in order to get this stuff, in order to compete with the farming co-ops and get food out to the market. After the war, Europe recovered much quicker than usual. All of a sudden, there's a glut in the market of food. Nobody can sell their food anymore because there's way too much of it out there. These farmers were faced with a debt that they could no longer repay. That's when the banks come into play because they could not recover this money that they were owed. Farmers were defaulting on these second mortgages. Banks were failing. Second part of that whole issue there was what I found out. In the early 20s, state banks were prohibited from branching. Federal banks had started being allowed to branch, the big federal banks.
They weren't allowed to build a branch?
They were not
It's like
allowed
illegal?
to branch, they were not. So if your bank was in a farming community and that farming community failed, your bank failed. Okay, the national banks, they could have a branch in an industrial sector, they could have a branch in a suburban sector, if there was such a thing in the 20s. They could have a branch in an industrial sector, in a farming sector. If one branch started failing, they could shift funds. They could protect themselves. Small local branches couldn't do that. States wanted banks close to the people. Sounds good, but that prevention of diversifying caused their failures. Banks started to fail, people started to panic, okay? I have one article that talks about the fact, was it, what is it? It's either bank, they said, is it bank failures or bank shakeout? Okay, the big banks, which were allowed to branch, were starting to compete with these small little banks. The small little banks couldn't hold up. So what you have basically is a kind of a shakeout of banking. Again, the Federal Reserve would protect the big banks, but they did nothing for the small banks. Advertised as a loan, as a lender of last resort, they did not lend to the small banks in order to protect them. That created havoc in the banking industry, okay? You think about what's going on in the 20s, you have a whole lot of industry changing, okay? You have factories going from one production method to another production method. You have new markets opening up, new products opening up. Anytime you have shifts in the economy like that going on, you're going to have unemployment as labor moves from one area to another. It's got to happen, okay? You can't prevent that from happening. But what did happen was because of bank failures, money started drying up, people would pull out the money they have, all of a sudden the money supply started depreciating, not because of the feds, but, well, it would have if they would have supplied money for these banks, but you had the money supply depreciating, which meant that the people had no money to buy products. Products sat in the shelves. Industry started shutting down because they had product they couldn't sell. It was a snowballing effect from one thing to another, okay? The stock market
You know,
eventually...
what you're saying though, Dale, is it sounds like and it keeps going on, the civil authorities, if you will, caused the problem and then managed to blame the banks for causing the problem and deflect blame from themselves.
You probably could say that. I'm not sure what you're looking at
I'm
as your basis of
I'm looking
that.
right now to shut down Wall Street. Okay, it's amazing what's happening. I can't believe it when I look at this. I can't believe what I'm seeing. People are upset at Wall Street bankers for taking government money and paying bonuses to their presidents. Nobody's upset at the idiots that gave them the money.
I know.
I just, I can't believe it. Every time I see that again, I'm like,
Well, that's two
what am I looking
generations
at?
of public education at work.
Well, yeah, I guess it wasn't as extensive then. Randy, you had your hand up.
I just want to make a comment. Shortly before the crash of '29, Kennedy, old man Kennedy, pulled all his money out of it. Pulled all his money out, sold all the stock. He was solid in cash or gold, okay?
Right, right.
He bought up properties for 10 cents on the dollar. Most of the big boys upstairs pulled their money out. The money supply just literally dried up. There was no money. You have the same situation in there. This is insanity what's happening today. I mean, it's a mirrored image of what happened in '29, and everybody's dancing around who's creating what. And Rothschild says, let me control the money of the country, and I don't care who makes the laws. Well, that I think has changed ever so slightly, where the government and Rothschild are in bed together.
Yeah.
Now you got a real serious problem.
Yeah. They've been that way for quite a while. Let's move on to
Joel, if I could, just
Yeah.
real quick.
Oh, yes.
We have a limited number of copies of a short article called The Great Depression. It's out of the New American Magazine from 2008. We're figured it would spark some interest, so there's limited copies back here. The other thing I wanted to mention is, as far as the Federal Reserve goes, probably, if not the best, one of the best books on the Federal Reserve is called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I happen to have here. And there's it just explains the whole thing, fractional reserve banking. There's pictures of Aldrich and Warburg and Vanderlip and all those guys. What they did, it reads like a novel. I mean, the congressmen and senators disguising themselves to travel to Georgia on a train, using different names so that to meet on Jekyll Island, which is an island off of Georgia there, to form the Federal Reserve. It's a very fascinating book. Just wanted to mention it.
Warburg was Rothschild's agent here in the United States.
We
They
definitely
were all
had
in bed together.
Yeah, it was not a time when the interests of Americans were paramount. Maybe we should say it that way. But the question is, biblically speaking, it seems to me if you were committed to honest weights and measures all throughout, you wouldn't have this happen. But once you get away from that, anything is possible. And when you get to dishonest weights and measures, somebody is stealing something somewhere. It's happening.
Do you want to mention, we just talked about this today, negative law versus positive law.
But yeah, go ahead, John.
The Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. One, to regulate our behavior. What it leaves open is everything else. What we've switched to is positive law, where the government says, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. And there's no end of those things. And it's all too good. Now we're getting to the point where we need to think certain ways. We need to positively follow all the regulations. There's never going to be an end to those regulations. The biblical admonitions are almost all negative sanctions. You know, don't do these things, which allows for lots more freedom. And so we've really switched.
We talked about that today. Think of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They have positive law or negative law? Count them, one negative law. You do anything you want, eat anything you want, only don't eat from this tree. That's godly law, negative law. You don't do certain things. Not you do this, you do that, you jump through hoops, you gotta be careful where. I mean, how many of you have a panic attack every time you want to park close to the door at the Walmart or whatever? A little panic attack. Oh man, look, is this a handicap spot here? Did the sign fall down? Look down, see if maybe the paint faded. Man, wow.
You know, really, we're at critical mass now, and really we should be somewhere along the way saying, here are some simple steps that we can take to sort of prepare ourselves. Because if we're at critical mass, we have something like November 5th, on November 5th or later, we're all going to be in this.
Yeah, we are.
Yep.
And so,
we are.
We really should be talking about, at some point.
I want to talk about that perhaps a little bit later. We had a question about Pulpit Freedom Sunday. How many of you have heard of this? Yeah, it was earlier. It was the first Sunday in October. And but before we get into this, is there anything before we take up too much time? Is there anything that someone brought tonight that they really want to bring out? They want to ask before we move on? Yes, Barbara.
I just want to make a quick comment.
Yes.
I started listening to Pastor Paul, Randy,
Yes.
the speakers'
Yes.
sermons. I just picked some on sermon audio. I got Exodus, 7th commandment. I listened to 2 or 3 sermons dealing with mankind, marriage, family. If Christians listen to these 2 sermons, 3 sermons, we would be revolutionized, because what he does is he takes it back to the whole point of our being here and the vision. If you don't have the vision that that husband and wife are there to build God's kingdom and family dominion, etc. If you don't have that vision, you have some other vision, and it's self-agenda, whatever.
Right, it's going to be the wrong vision.
If you just simply get back to that very initial vision that God gave, commandment, and individuals, families begin that. And the thing is that when you're obeying God, God gives his own blessings. It's not just that we reap more than we sow when we're obeying God, because